that might help people think about that.
You know, it reminds me of Gandhi's statement that nonviolence is a way of life. And so I'm thinking, how do nonviolence and restorative justice relate to each other?
Well, I think nonviolence is one of the fundamental values that has pushed restorative justice. I had a former student who did a study on the value systems underlying, and that was one of the key ones that he articulated, that he had heard from people doing restorative justice. Nonviolence, not only in the sense of not harming another, or trying to reduce the harm to another, but respecting each other. I mean, that was part of what Gandhi meant by that. It was a deep respect that, as the Quakers say, a bit of God in all of us, to remind us of that. And restorative justice would say the same thing. So I think there's a lot of connection between it.
I'm thinking in terms of movement. Sometimes in this conflicted world that we live in, it's hard for us to see that there's any movement at all. I'm wondering from your perspective what you see in terms of the restorative justice movement from the time that you began to, like where it is now.
On one level, we have a long way to go. In fact, the U.S. is behind much of the world in restorative justice explicitly. And there's a lot that's not restorative. But when you look at where we started 30 years ago and where it is to now, it is astounding. I mean, today it is truly an international, not just a movement, it's a field. I mean, every continent has restorative justice programs going on. The European Common Market mandated its members last year to start doing restorative justice programs. I mean, there are restorative justice programs in Russia and Israel, and there's some new ones starting in Japan and South Korea. And, I mean, it's just amazing as you look at it from the perspective of where we were 30 years ago. I always said that when you introduce a new idea, first it's ignored, second it's fought, and then it's co-opted. And that's the downside, because also it is popular enough now that it's being co-opted. Everybody wants to do restorative justice. So they're claiming all kinds of things are restorative justice. And I've heard some terrible stories of people calling things restorative justice. So that's the downside of success, I suppose. So, I mean, like I say, we have a long way to go, and yet when you look at where we've come in 3 short decades, it's pretty encouraging.
It's interesting. It was somebody from Metro Health here in town who gave me your book.
Oh, really?
So through the Metro Health District, you need to read this book, And that said more to me than it came from somebody in the city, in the government.
Funny, it's also funny that the publisher goofed up when it first came out and didn't publicize it. They didn't get any reviews out. They just completely lost everything I had given them. They'd asked me for journals and stuff. And so it sort of took off in spite of that. So that was nice.
And you knew.
Yeah.
People must have connected with it somehow.
I think that, I think it's,
myself.
I think it's just, a lot of people tell me it articulates things I already thought about or already know, or values. It draws the lines between the dots in something that I already knew. And I think that's really what it is. I think it's basically articulating what we all know in some way.
Giving language.
Giving language and realizing, as far as criminal justice is concerned, that, this applies in that field too. We have been taught for so many years that crime is different than everything else, that you can't do things the normal way when it comes to crime. And, I mean, when you talk to Rotary clubs and people come up to me and say, that's what happened when I was a kid. I did this. They tell me these stories about how their parents handle it, and it sounds like restorative justice a lot of times.
Must be rich.
So it's
to hear these stories.
Well, the kind of stories that really inspire me. I had a young woman a few years ago come up to me and said, "I want you to know what restorative justice has meant to my family." She said, "We were victims of a serious crime, and it really impacted." They lived in Toronto. It really impacted us, especially my father. And then we went through a process, and we met the person who did it, and it really, again, my father was particularly impacted by it. And she said, we had a really bad relationship, but he decided he wanted to be a mediator, and he took a training, and he learned listening skills, and he came back, and we sorted that out. And then she said, one day he was downtown Toronto, and who does he run into but his offender? And the offender says, I got to tell you, that meeting with you changed my life. And she says, now that's my life. I've been working in the field, and I'm going on to graduate school. That's going to be my life. So you just never know. You just never know what one time in California, one of the programs out there had an elderly man who went through their training but never volunteered to do it because they were using volunteer facilitators. And one day his daughter called and said, yeah, no, Dad went through the training and he'd never done any mediation for you, but I want you to know what it meant. He said, our family was estranged. We were so estranged we couldn't do holidays. We didn't do Thanksgiving. We didn't do Christmas. But after Dad went through this training, he called us all together and he said, we need to have a victim offender reconciliation. And we did it. And she says, now we have Christmas and now we have Thanksgiving. So, I mean, it's not just crime and it's not just, it's just spin-offs that sometimes matter as much as anything else.
Could you describe that circle process?
Talked recently to Molly Baldwin, who's the executive director of an organization called ROCA in Boston that deals with gangs, and they've been using circle process a lot, and they've gotten Native American elders to help teach the circles because they have also in the community a lot of Hmong people and others who the circle resonates for them as well. And so she was telling me the story. She said we had a young child was run over in the city, and the whole community, it was an accident, but it was just brought out all the tensions. And the funeral turned into a brawl. So there were two young girls, one of whose mother had just died, the other was a drug addicted, and these two girls were street kids, and they began to fight, and it just turned into a whole brawl. But these two girls had been through circle training, and suddenly in the middle of the brawl, they stop and look at each other, and they say, we need a circle. And so they go back to ROCA headquarters, they get some adults, and for the next 3 hours, they grieved together, they talked about what they'd done, and so forth. And then at the end of the 3 hours, they looked at the adults and said, we're hungry, what's to eat? Which I suppose figures it. But she was saying it was such a powerful process, and they had learned the circle process enough to know that that's what they needed in the middle of that fight. Mm-hmm. One of my former students was a Fulbright student. He was a top police commander from Pakistan. He had thousands of people under him. And he came and got really interested in restorative justice. Started on his practicum. I sent him to Rochester, New York, where he started working with gang members in prison and got them all to sit down in circles and start talking to each other. The staff was totally amazed. But he told me he also began to use the circle with his family. So every week, he and his wife and his kids sat down with a circle and talked about the week.
Mm-hmm. Transformed his life. We want to thank Howard for being with us today, and we want to thank all of you for being with us in our conversation today about restorative justice. At the end of the program, you'll find information about how you can find out more about Howard and his work, and specifically about restorative justice, as well as the Peace Center's website and the work that we've been up to lately. So again, we want to thank you for being with us. And so from deep in our heart to deep into your hearts, may peace prevail.